Hi, everybody. We're recording, we're live streaming, and we're going to get started shortly for our second episode of Radical Breaks and Remakes. I'm Dan Aviv. I will be your host for this weird excursion into the current moment in history. Just getting set up here on my end, trying to figure out all the technical challenges that we face on an ongoing basis. So let's get started. So last week in the evening, it was because it was the evening. That's our usual slot is 8 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. Obviously, at that time this week, we'll be in various seders. But I wanted to sort of share with you this concept, Uvda Dechol, because of its sudden prominence in the discourse today in 2020 as we roll into the first seder in a number of hours. Excuse me. But before I get into Uvda Dechol, I want to get into what's arguably the biggest technological advance in human history before the internet, and that's represented on the screen in front of you. That's the Gutenberg Bible. It's one of the earliest major books printed using mass-produced movable type by Johannes Gutenberg in the 1450s. There's about 170 copies existing, floating around. About less than 50 survive today. 11 of them, I think 11, are in the United States. They are very expensive. In 2007, I think a single leaf of the Bible sold for something like $75,000. So it's a very valuable book, and I can get into all the different auction histories. But the idea that this ability to mass produce texts was a massive leap forward and made the Protestant Reformation possible. You know, Luther's 95 Theses wouldn't have really gone anywhere had it not been for the printing press. And in the Jewish world, the rabbis did not immediately suspect, because you would think today, like if we took the rabbis of today and teleported them back in history or did some other kind of time travel thought exercise, we would expect that like the traditional set of rabbis would have been militantly opposed to the printing press, that it somehow undermined traditional scribe work, that maybe people would be tempted to print Torah scrolls. I don't know. But the thing is that, surprisingly, the rabbis of the 15th century regarded the printing press as a boon to learning. They regarded print making and using the printing press as avodat kodesh, as sacred or holy work. And they even went as far as to say that the printing press itself was like a mizbech, was like an altar. It was that holy and sacred, because they saw the potential that the printing press provided for Jewish learning and the dissemination of Jewish ideas. They saw this new media for its potential, and they saw it for its positive potential, and they embraced it wholeheartedly. And in 1475, Jewish publishers began to print the first books in Hebrew. Now, there's an arbitrary cutoff date, which, despite my research into this, I could not discover why they chose 1501 as the cutoff. But if it's a printed book before 1501, it's called an incunabula. And if it's after 1501, I guess they just call it a book. But Hebrew printers were already at it before 1501. They were printing Hebrew texts, and one would think that the first Hebrew text that would be printed would have been a Chumash, like the Pentateuch, the 5 books of the Torah, or a Tanakh. But actually, the first Hebrew book that was printed was Rashi's commentary on the Torah. It was published in Reggio, Calabria, by Abraham Garton on February 5th, 1475. I love being in a period of history where you can actually date it down to the day. You know, like February 3rd didn't exist. February 4th, it exists. And if you can see on your screens to the right, on the right side here, that's what we call today, on your computer, maybe called Garton Rashi or just Rashi script. But the thing is that Garton used this font or typeface to set it apart from the sacred text, which was in square print or Assyrian script, as they call it. And Rashi never used this script. When he would never have associated this font with himself. It's based on a Sephardi style cursive Hebrew script, and Garten used it, and then it became kind of the convention that this would be used for commentaries, especially Rashi. Now, the thing is that I guess simultaneous to the publication of Rashi's commentary were other books that were equally kind of weird because, again, one would think that it would be the Torah or the Tanakh that would get published first. But historians will tell us that the second text was the Arba'at Turim, which is like a halachic Coles Notes, I guess. It was finished in 1475 on July 3rd, and it was printed by Meshulam Kusi in Italy also. It was published in Venice in 1594. So we already get a sense that like Jews are going to use this technology to disseminate Jewish learning. It's going to disseminate commentaries. It's going to disseminate halachic guides. And that's really where the rabbis are at this time. They also were printing responsum as well. Here's a sample. This is a sample of the Arba Turim, one of the volumes, one of the 4 columns in the book. And here's a sample of the responsum, or rabbinic rulings on questions that were posed to them. This particular one, which is of interest to my partner, is about the question of whether you should, as a member of a congregation, you know, choice between a volunteer who would be the cantor or the chazan. Should you prefer a paid cantor or a volunteer wannabe? And the Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret, answers definitively, you should always take a cantor because the unskilled one's always going to want to show off and, you know, pretend and whatever, and it's not desirable for a chazan, for a cantor. Jewish printers would go on to use this new technology, this new media, to print the Siddur and Haggadot and the Torah with commentaries and the Mishnah and the Talmud and important books written by rabbis. All of which is to say that there wasn't always this antipathy, this kind of suspicion, this keep it at arm's length attitude about technology from the rabbinical set. But then modernity happened. And what I mean by that is that, you know, a series of thinkers kind of stormed the world stage at the time, and it's mostly the European stage, but you know, they colonized the rest of the world, so let's just say the world stage. And these thinkers, you know, challenged the status quo in the way that people saw the world. Modernity, if anything else, allowed humans to use their reason, their rationality, their rationalism to confront the world, but also to change it. And one of the ideas that emerged, especially from the writings of guys like Spinoza and Mendelssohn, was that there are no more gatekeepers. There are no more filters. There's not going to be somebody who's going to be in charge and remove or block or censor unacceptable ideas. The idea is that there's unquestioned absolute authorities in the world, whether it be a rabbi or a pope or the king. That's done. That's finished. And modernity, for those that want modernity, would be immensely freeing. You know, the notion that I'm free to ask questions. I'm free to be skeptical. I'm free to wonder about the world and think about how things can be different. Things can be better than the way they are now. That would be tremendously appealing to somebody, you know, who's a free thinker, who's quote unquote open-minded. But for somebody traditional, for somebody who embraces and is very much invested in the status quo and in tradition, modernity seems like lawlessness, chaos, anarchy, and it had to be resisted at all costs. So in the traditional world, and again, I'm going to pivot a little bit because we talked about all those guys before. Those guys all lived in Central and Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, which is the cradle of Jewish civilization when it comes to traditional Jewish scholarship in the medieval and pre-modern and modern times, modernity didn't really have as many inroads as it did in Central and Western Europe. And Jews remained a community apart in parts of Eastern Europe well into the 20th century, living under the eye of rabbinic supervision and their authority, adhering to their rabbi's interpretation of halakha and Jewish law. These communities were eventually uprooted and displaced by war, by the Shoah. They relocated to North America. They relocated to Israel. where these modern societies on a daily basis confronted these communities with the reality that they no longer live in a pre-modern bubble. They live in the modern world. What they do or what they choose to do about that is up to them. And so I'm always reminded of this kind of ongoing paradox or ongoing dilemma. Back, and again, it goes, I guess I'm dating myself. There was a time before the conflict with Palestine, heated up in Israel, that when things were relatively peaceful, the some ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods would erupt into violence every Shabbat because young folks, the Avrahim, would come out on the afternoons and throw rocks at cars. It's primarily in Jerusalem. This was a thing. And they would stand at the street corners, primarily like at the intersection where Geula, the neighborhood, which is a heavily ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, would border Bar Ilan Street, which would take people basically from the university and the neighborhoods in the north of town to the center of town. And they would stand at the intersections on their side of the barrier, and they would yell Shabbos at traffic driving by. And they would throw rocks, and the police would come, etc. And I was always wondered, why they did that. I mean, I have a calendar. If I was driving a car, or if I had a calendar, I'd know that, yeah, today is Shabbat. So what, are you yelling at me to remind me that it's Shabbat? Or gee, thanks for reminding me, guys. I guess I'll pull my car over to the side and walk the rest of the way. That didn't really make sense. But what made more sense, and this teaching was shared with me by a professor of mine, Zvi Beckerman at the Hebrew University. He said, they're not yelling Shabbos to yell at the driver. They're yelling Shabbos to remind themselves that it's Shabbat, because reality doesn't jibe with their reality, in the sense that how could they live in a world? How could this be a world in which these people, the car drivers, are driving on Shabbat? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't compute that it's Shabbat and these people are driving their cars. They're not supposed to be driving their cars on Shabbos. So by yelling Shabbos, I'm reminding myself that it's Shabbos more than them. But in a sense, this is easily understood also from a psychological standpoint. It's the backfire effect. There was a book written in 1956. It was called When Prophecy Fails. It was written by Leon Festinger. He was doing research, or I guess field work, with a UFO cult in California. And the UFO cult leader said, on such and such a date, the UFO is going to come and take us away. And when the date came and the UFO didn't show up, the followers in the cult, they could have gone one of two ways. They could have said, oh, I guess, I was wrong, and UFO cults, the UFO's not coming, and game over. Or, which is what most of the folks did, is they doubled down on their belief. They felt like, oh, we weren't good enough UFO cult members, so that's why the UFO didn't come. And we find this phenomena in playing out all over Facebook. That when you confront somebody with facts that disprove their take on whatever issue, everyone's an expert on constitutional law, everyone's an expert on epidemiology. As soon as you come and you say, well, the position you just took, here's three facts that disprove it, they're like, no, I reject your facts. Your facts are biased, and you're wrong, and I'm right, and they double down on what they say. So in a sense, this is a very common psychological phenomena that the traditional community is no different in that sense, that when they're confronted with the modern world coming at them from all directions, they double down on their tradition even more. And so they will close their neighborhoods off, put a barrier in the street, and the city government in Jerusalem will sanction it and allow it. And in some areas where there's even more ultra-Orthodox living, they shut down full neighborhoods. Sometimes even, they shut down the whole city itself. The town could be closed off for Shabbat. But it's much easier to do that than to police every individual in that community. Someone's going to buy a flip phone, right? Someone's going to bring a computer into their house. Someone's going to connect up to the internet. What do you do then? So in the late 1990s, when the internet was taking off, the World Wide Web at the time is what they called it. And everyone was putting up websites, using Netscape and Navigator and all these other web browsers that don't exist anymore. Somebody in the Satmar community created a website explaining what Satmar Hasidism was. This is the same Satmars that are featured in the Netflix series Unorthodox. It was written in HTML. There was no drag and drop. There was no Squarespace. Hey, just pull it together in 5 minutes. Like, you literally had to write the code out yourself. And this guy, this anonymous person, wrote the page in English. And across the top of the homepage, in a banner, that was written the following sentence in Yiddish: "If you can read this, you should not be using the internet. It is muktzah." Now, muktzah is a legal concept. It literally means set aside. And it refers to objects that are set aside for Shabbat and for holidays. So like Pesach coming up, there are certain objects that are considered muktzah for Pesach because they have no Shabbat or holy day purpose. So, for example, a credit card could be muktzah on Shabbat because it has no Shabbat purpose. And if you're a traditional practicing Jew, maybe you could say the same about a guitar also is muktzah because it has no traditional Shabbat purpose. You're not allowed to touch it. You're not allowed to move it. And so muktzah is sort of like this kind of free range, freewheeling concept of like the forbidden. It's like haram in Islam, right? It's like, you don't touch it. It's forbidden. So the internet kind of it's already starting to take on this idea that the internet is muktzah. And then you start to see the Pashkevilim come up. This is just like a sample of Pashkevilim from the last, I would say, 10 or so years. The one on the left, the headline screaming, Machti'e harabim, like it leads the many astray. And then you have on the right here, a Das Torah, which is like a statement of law from some rabbis. And you can see there the iPhone, Machshirei Android, iPad, BlackBerry. This is back when, BlackBerry was still a thing. MP4s, v'chadome. Like these are dangerous for the whole against the sacredness. It's a threat to the sacredness of the people of Israel. You cannot have these devices and these. You can't have these devices. Period. But we know that people do. Here's another one: the dangers of the computer. I could get into the details. Lately, these mashchitim, these corruptings that our fathers have never had to contend with, have come into our homes through the back door, through a computer. And they threaten to destroy the holiness of the Jewish people. Here's another one. 67 were chased away and sold. They sold their wives and children in 2011 because of the internet and unkosher technology. And in the lower right, here's this great cartoon. Where's Yoseleh? It's 6 frames, where in the upper right-hand frame, there's Yoseleh sitting with his parents, his beaming, shining parents, and he's using the computer. And by frame 6, he's Satan himself. Looks more like Gollum, I guess, from the Lord of the Rings, without the horns. He's transformed into a monster. Here's some more. Pashkevilim from around the ultra-Orthodox world. And you'll notice there's a lot of mention of sartan, of cancer. Internet brings cancer. There's no rain, there's no blessing. Internet is cancer. Well, how do we know internet is cancer? Because if you add up the numerical values of the word internet and the cancer, that equals the same. It's 319. On the lower left, you'll see under the bottom there's a gemach, which is like a charitable organization who gets together to help people disconnect from the internet. It's like if you can't afford the penalty you have to pay when you disconnect from Rogers or your cell phone company or whatever, your internet company, they will come in and pay it for you. On the upper right, you start to see language of like to'eva. This is an abomination. The internet is avi avota tuma. It's like the highest class category of impurity. It's terrible. But the thing is, when you play gematria games, it's fun, and you can come up with some very interesting combinations, but it's really not a basis for public policy because, 319, the numeric value of internet and for cancer also equals apartheid. It also equals Boker Tov, good morning. And it also equals marmalade. So, marmalade, you got to watch for marmalade. It could be a very pernicious condiment. I guess it's a condiment. No, it's a spread, a very pernicious spread in your house. So watch out for marmalade. You should maybe mobilize against that too. And just in case you're wondering about whether the Pashkevilim have anything to say about Corona, here's one that Corona is because of the lack of modesty of women. Women and daughters, return in tshuva and be hakpedna. You should be strict about sniut, about modesty in all matters of halacha. Because in gematria, it's equal to 900, right? It adds up, I guess, that these things add up. So be careful. I wag my finger at you. This, I guess you could say, culminated in what's called the Asefa, the Internet Asefa of 2012. This massive rally took place was launched or convened by Ichud HaKihilot L'Tohar HaMachaneh, the Union of Communities for the Purity of the Camp. This is like a biblical concept that, like Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, when they were wandering through the desert, like in a camp, and like anything that was impure was put outside the camp. So they're trying to maintain the purity of the camp by coming out hard against the internet. It was supposed to raise awareness, and you can see here it's at Citi Field. It was packed, 60,000 plus people, and in Citi Field, and also at Arthur Ashe Stadium also had an overflow, and then they were broadcasting it on closed circuit television as well. It was supposed to raise awareness about the internet and the negative impact of the internet. And there was speech after speech about the evils of going online and to promote the use of internet filters. Women weren't allowed to attend the rally, obviously, for religious reasons, and the media wasn't allowed because of Homeland Security reasons. But the thing is I watched this rally in real time, live, as it were, from my house, because some guy was there with his iPhone and he was live streaming it. So I guess I really don't know how to deal with that kind of level of irony. And the thing is that when the people that came, they were given flyers on their way in by various companies that were, flacking various filters and kosher GPS apps for iPhone and Android that allow them to like find synagogues and, kosher restaurants. But the interesting thing is, they weren't talking about bans anymore. The Pashkevilim we saw before from 2007, 2008, 2010, 2011, they kind of dropped that language altogether. The Haredi world acknowledged that the barbarians are not at the gate. They're already in the living room. So now they're talking about filters, which is in a sense an admission of defeat. Because since then, not since 2012, even before that, the Haredi world has already commanded some space in cyberspace for themselves. This website you're seeing in front of you is called Bechadrei Charedim. It's a pun, a Hebrew pun, because Bechadrei Chadarim means kind of like in camera. It's sort of like behind closed doors. And they switch the letters of Chadarim and Charedim. So it's like, this is the website in the rooms of the Charedim. And you can see here, it looks almost like any, usual web page for a periodical. The main information is sort of, it's Hebrew. So it's right to left, not left to right. So like the headlines are on the right and then the ads are on the left. And there's different sections. There's internet, there's news, politics. You can see here as the second one. Then there's the third one is in the courts of the Rebbes. So it's like close coverage of the Hasidic sects. And then you have business. And at the bottom, you have the women's lobby. So it's like women news. But you can also look at the ads on the left. And you can see on the upper left-hand corner, you have a WhatsApp group for Chadrei Chadarim. And then there's also on Twitter too. So they're not rejecting modernity per se. They're using its tools for its own purposes, but at the same time they can't really not use these tools because people are already there. It's like the oxygen we breathe is modernity, that you can't hold your breath forever. And you can see the picture of the day. And they also got, by the way, they got hacked in December 2011. And the editors, CEO and executives were arrested for extortion in 2012 because they apparently were trying to peddle influence. And you can see here a music section, there's a op-ed section, there's a section on transportation, and then, there's an English page as well. Chabad is many things, but they're also innovators in technology as well. This is a website for their Shluchim online school. This was the first completely online Jewish day school. It opened in 2005. They've been around for 15 years. It was set up to educate the children of rabbis who Chabad sends all over the globe. So this is a way, it's almost like the International Baccalaureate program was set up because British diplomats didn't have a place to educate their kids. This is the Chabad equivalent where, I could be in Kathmandu running a Seder for backpackers, and my kids can still be educated properly through the online school. And you can see here the various sections, and they also have a section here for praying for somebody who's sick, and just this is like any typical website. But now we're sort of getting back to this concept of uvda b'chol. So we talked about muktzah as a concept of like this is an everyday object; it has no business on Shabbat. Now we're dealing with an interesting reality where, for many people, theoretically, there's a sort of a breakdown between these two categories. Just like there's a breakdown in the category of private and public, or indoors and outdoors. We're confronting the greatest challenge that our society or any society has had to confront is the COVID-19 outbreak and social isolation, physical distancing. And the only response we seem to have for it is what we're doing right now, is using technology, using the internet to connect to each other. What's the traditional world going to do? Because internet connectivity is every day. What about Shabbat? What about the holidays? This year, right? Pesach in the diaspora is Wednesday night, Thursday night. It ends. Yom Tov ends Thursday night, and it rolls right into ends Friday. It rolls right into Shabbat. Excuse me. It's Thursday, Friday, and it rolls right into Shabbat. So for 3 whole days, you're going to be disconnected from the world. And the thing is that the traditional world almost kind of made a shift that, on its face, doesn't seem like a big deal to us, but is a huge deal in the traditional war on modernity. Okay. And it ties into this concept, as I said, of uvdin dechol, which is basically you're not supposed to do weekday activities on Shabbat or on holy days. So what's the question to consider? Here's a question for you to consider. I live in an apartment building. Okay, it's Shabbat. I lock myself out of my house. My friend, who's also an observant Jew, is a locksmith. Can I ask him to use his picks to open the lock in my apartment? I live in apartment 2. So it's no question of him crossing the street or having to carry in public. There's none of that. Literally, I'm in apartment 2. He's apartment 3. He just pops his head in, grabs his lock picks, and then I'm into my place. Now, on its face, lock picking is permitted on Shabbat. He's not doing any. There's 39 categories of work prohibited on Shabbat, and lock picking is not one of them. However, some rabbis would say it is not permitted because of uvda dechol, right? That like this is a weekday activity. This is not locks on Shabbats, therefore he can't do it for you. But it begs a more fundamental question. What beyond not doing work is considered uvda dechol? What beyond abstaining from work makes Shabbat different from the weekday? And this is where you start to get into trouble, because every example that people bring up in responsa or rabbinic discussions, someone says, no, that's not a good example. So the list of what defines a weekday activity seems to be this. That's my terrible typing. I apologize. It's an activity that requires exertion. It's an activity that is connected to commerce or professions, and it's an activity that's connected to malacha. So it's either connected to work, or requires exertion. So what does it have to do with 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic and what the event that's happening tonight? Well, Zoom. Is using Zoom, does it fall into one of those 3 categories? Does it require exertion? Not really. Is it connected to commerce or professions? Well, yes, but no, because we're using it to talk to our family and friends. And is it connected to melacha? Well, that's really the interesting question. So the traditional world has already come to some kind of modus vivendi with electricity. Under certain circumstances, it can be used with like a Shabbat elevator or Shabbat timer, meaning you sort of set it to do what you want it to do before Shabbat, and then you leave it alone, and it happens on its own on Shabbat. But what about Zoom for the Seder? Can we use Zoom for the Seder? If I set it up before and turn it on, leave my laptop open on my table, can I be in touch with my grandfather who's by himself in a nursing home? So the question was posed, I guess, to plenty of rabbis, and eventually a psak halacha, a rabbinic ruling, was released on Tuesday, March 21st by the union of the sages of the West in the land of Israel. The rabbis who signed this letter included the head of Jerusalem's rabbinic court, the chief rabbi of Kiryat Gat, and Rabbi Aharon Cohen of Yakir. These guys are primarily Sephardic rabbis. And in their ruling, they wrote that it was permitted for 2020 to launch Zoom before the Yom Tov, the holiday begins, and then leave it running for, quote, those that need it, and that this would not constitute a violation of halacha. They added that it was possible to be lenient about this prohibition of uvda dechol, given the special circumstances, and that there was no reason to be concerned that somehow being lenient around this Seder in 2020 would lead people down the garden path to think that it was okay to use Zoom any other time. Here's the quote. We were, and again, look at the question itself. Very important how the question is phrased. Any lawyer or legal scholar will tell you how the question is phrased is just as important as the answer, because either the question will be framed too narrowly or too broadly, in which case the ruling will take that into account. Look at the last sentence. For the purpose of the Seder, is it permitted to use this program in this moment of emergency only? So again, we're looking for a heter, like an exemption or permission to use Zoom in this fashion this evening for this purpose only. And they answered, yes, it is permitted. Within 12 hours of this letter being released to the public, the Ashkenazi establishment fired back. There were a series of statements from Rabbi Menachem Pearl, who's the head of the Tzomit Institute. It's like a think tank that tries to customize technology and electronic appliances so that they can comply with halacha, and along with some saucy hot takes from the Israel's chief Ashkenazi rabbi, David Lau. He said the ruling was, quote, irresponsible, beyond absurd, and showing the lack of even a minimal understanding of the meaning of a halachic ruling. It's a shame that such people mislead the public. Oof. And then this statement on your screen was released by the chief rabbinate of Israel on March 31st. That is, the chief Ashkenazi and the chief Sephardi rabbi signed off on it together. If I had to sum up the statement in one phrase, I would say we're holding the line. Now, these Piskei Din, these kind of statements of law are sort of gathered under the rubric of Erev Pesach 5780 halachic instructions. So it's like very specific to this year. But they also sort of encompass the everyday as well as Shabbat. So for example, the first item about praying in a minyan, praying in a group of 10, it's explicitly forbidden. Item 3, mourning. You can comfort mourners via telephone or email. But the best item is saved for last. Number 10, that's on the second page on your left, right above the seals of approval there, the signatures, that about the use of electronics for conference calls for the Seder. The Psak refers to the recent possibility of using a computer on Yom Tov in a place where, quote, there is no fear of danger or health need or pikuach nefesh. This psak reminds us that using electricity in Yom Tov on a holiday is prohibited, and that even with a timer, it's not prohibited. It's prohibited, and that the audio is not authorized. So, like, they came down hard, and they're like, no, you can't use a timer. Audio is it's treif, it's muktzah. And the following line, here's the quote, the key line here. I'll put it up there for you. So this is what. Let me go back. Sorry. Let me read that last line for you. Quote, loneliness is painful through the computer before the Yom Tov begins. However, not through desecrating the holy day in the way that has been permitted only in cases of pikuach nefesh, as mentioned. Now, I want to go back and look at these readings very closely again. So the question, as I said, was framed in a very specific way. For the purpose of the Seder, is it permitted to use the program in this moment of emergency only? Okay, they're not saying, can I use Zoom whenever I want? It's, can I use Zoom for the Seder in a moment of emergency? And again, is the moment of emergency describing that we're under quarantine? Is it describing that I'm having mental health issues because I'm being isolated? It's not specified. It's left kind of open. So in the ruling, they say for those that need it, you can use it. So I think what possibly upset the Ashkenazi establishment that's traditionally more conservative in their understanding and application of Jewish law is that by ruling this thing as kosher when it's not kosher, you're basically kind of opening the barn door a little bit here. And once you open the barn door, it's going to be hard to close, especially with all the guys running through, all the animals running out of the barn. And here's the ruling. As I said, I alluded to this before. Loneliness is painful, and one should find a response for it, perhaps with a conversation through the computer before the Yom Tov begins. However, not through desecrating the holy day in the way that has been permitted only in cases of pikuach nefesh as mentioned. Pikuach nefesh is a concept in Jewish law that means to save or preserving a life. A life is in danger. So, for example, if someone is having a heart attack on Shabbat, can you drive them to the hospital? Of course you can. Can you call 911? Can you take any and all measures to preserve a life? The answer is yes. Pikuach nefesh dochesh Shabbat. It cancels. It pushes off the Shabbat. So here also. So what they're saying, and notice I added the emphasis that only in cases of pikuach nefesh as mentioned, which again has been interpreted in the popular press to say, well, the chief rabbinate shut it down. No Zoom seders for the traditional world, for the observant Jews. But if you look closely, again, what they're saying is it's only been permitted in cases of pikuach nefesh, which is a signal, I guess, that, if not to me personally, but I imagine that this is probably happening, that individuals are going to their individual rabbis and they are getting an exemption for mental health reasons. That the mental health costs of extended isolation is a matter of pikuach nefesh, and rabbis are quietly giving permission for people to do this. They're not publicizing it. They don't want it publicized. They don't want it to be a discussion in public. But essentially what this whole back and forth has signaled, essentially, well, let me backtrack a bit. This conversation's been going on for a very long time, for months, if not years. And the letter of the Union of the Sages of the West basically said the quiet out loud, which has become more normalized lately. But because before, rabbis would come to many an arrangement with their congregants, with the people in their communities about various issues that if they had to go public, they would take a different position. Sephardim have been known historically as being more progressive in halachic rulings, which, because their progressive stance on this was made public for various reasons, I guess they were pressured into it, or they felt they needed to because people would apply the ruling inconsistently or use it to justify all kinds of behaviors. So they felt they needed to go public with this letter and say, only in this case, in this circumstance, in this day, can you use Zoom in this manner, etc. So because they went public to sort of rein people in a little bit, the Ashkenazim had to come out and rein that in even more. But on the down low, quietly, hush, hush, people are probably doing it. It's possible that they're doing it, and it's possible that they were given permission to do it as well. But again, the reality is that, the leadership is trying to do what Tevye bemoaned after he was approached by Perchik and his, who was it? It was Motel Zeitel with Hodel and Perchik when they announced to him that they were getting married. He says, quote, "One little time I pulled out a thread and look where it's led, or where has it led?" Right? It started with the tailor, Motel the tailor, and him going that untraditional way, and now look what happened. That's a precedent, and now the next one's doing this. And as we know, what happened with the third daughter, tear your shirt and mourn. The thing is that the thread's already been pulled, and COVID-19 has only heightened the contradictions and kind of forces us to confront what we didn't want to know or didn't want to see. And we can't pretend that that the Haredi world is not using technology on a regular basis. What remains to be seen and going forward is what we choose to remember about what we've been doing now when this is all over. And it's not just in the Haredi world. I mean, I'm talking about, every aspect of our society that's been, flipped on its head in the last 3 weeks. In the United States, there are all this discussion about where are we going to get the money for this program or that program, but suddenly, they're banding about trillions of dollars as if they just have to open up a drawer and start handing out money. Countries in Europe that had been having discussions about programs like universal basic income for years, for decades, overnight they're like, well, like countries like Spain, there are government officials who said, well, we did this now, we probably will continue doing it even after COVID-19 is finished. So what changes are brought into play because of this pandemic remains to be seen. What will remain and what will become a new normal, or simply set aside in the thrill of being released from quarantine. In coming weeks, we're going to look at other phenomena and other radical breaks and possible remakes. If you have any thoughts or things you'd like to explore as part of this program, you can send me an email at drdanaviv, DRDANAVIV @gmail.com. I want to look at potentially like changes in fashion, changes in Jewish practice, changes in all kinds of things that we're doing now under the, I guess you could say, in a moment of crisis, and which of them will stick and which of them will not. So for those of you who will be celebrating the Seder with your families in your homes, I wish you a lovely Seder experience. For those of you doing it via Zoom, I wish you no glitching and a smooth sailing and screen sharing. So Chag Sameach to all of you. Bye.